My guest today is James Camus. And James, what do you have for us here today?
What I have is an answer to what is causing the drone lights in New Jersey. Now, it's caused first a lot of amazement, and then it went to concern, and finally it went to panic because the FBI and the government just couldn't figure it out. So what we're going to show you today is these are generated by geological forces. So the way it works is that instead of looking up to get the answer like the FBI and the government is doing, we're going to look down at layers of rocks. And what we find there is that the rocks are under great stress. That's because of continental drift, which is pushing against the New Jersey area, and the stress goes all the way out to the Midwest. And so you got that stress, and then you've also got rock layers, lots of them that go down into the deep earth, and they contain a mineral called quartz. And so what happens is with the stress, the rock layers move and the quartz emit kind of a spark in there. So that's what we're going to show you today, evidence that supports that theory. Now we'll go in here and talk about in a little more detail the theory. The recent appearance of very bright lights in the atmosphere above numerous American states are generated by geological forces. Talked about those, but just run it through again. Specifically, development of extreme compressional stuff with moves or leaves the rock layers not moving that are rich in quartz minerals. So what we're going to talk about is the generation of lights, and then we'll add to some of their characteristics. Finally, we'll get to the New Jersey lights and a little more discussion about this thing, which is the beginning of it. Then we'll talk about historical sightings. The interest there is that the theory that we're presenting here actually explains a lot of the historical sightings, things in the past. And finally, we'll talk about interpretation bias. So the screen on the left is what causes continental drift. So what happens in the lower semicircle in this slice through Earth is this dark red area. That's the core of the Earth. And the rocks there are pretty solid. There's really not any viscous lava, moving lava that comes out of there. And then the middle layer, which is very thick, shows some really dark red and some dark black areas, is called the mantle. Now, are there giant pockets or chambers of viscous lava in there? And occasionally they break loose and they move upward to the surface of the Earth. So the surface is this kind of dark gray line at the top of the slice through the globe. So what happens is that molten lava punches through the crust, the upper layer, and gets to the surface, and there the molten lava hardens, and that's along, that yellow is a little wider and longer on the surface. And so what happens is the molten lava hardens and sets, and then the next time there's a pulse of viscous lava up to that same spot, it cracks through the fault that's there, and it spreads out and moves the previous hardened stuff. And because of that movement, it puts stress on the rocks. So on the right side, you can see a close-up of that. And it's of interest is the yellow line there, the upper one, is actually the North American continent. And that's the area that there's been a lot of lava moving and stress. So as that pushes apart, you can see a red area on the upper left. That's the East Coast and the Midwest, and that's where a lot of stress has been placed on the rocks. So here is some of the proof that this stress is happening. So the left slide shows some red squares, yellow squares, and those are earthquakes that have happened over the last 2 years. And you can see that there's a lot of them, especially along the East Coast. That's where the plates really first come into the East Coast area. A lot of stress. So a lot of earthquakes. Then there are some earthquakes in really unusual areas. So in the upper left, Lake Michigan. Nobody really expects earthquakes there. And then along Lake Erie, and then down to the Ohio area, which is the third one kind of in the center. There's even one in Florida, which is not what you expect. So also on the top of this image, you can see that there's been earthquakes that carry up into Maine. Again, just rare. So that, and oh, then the lights, the circular lights, are where there's been sightings. So I want to emphasize here that that's not the only place where we have the lights. It's just where the compressional stress has actually moved the rocks. Other areas have these lights, but there's no earthquakes. And how that happens is the stress moves little microfractures. You don't really see any earthquakes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Here are some of the quotes that involve these earthquakes and what's going on. Quote, how are earthquakes happening in the Midwest? What are the boundaries here? There really aren't any internal faults or any reason. Simplest explanation for this pressure on the distant plate boundaries, interior plate boundaries like the Midwest area, is that the earthquakes are from extreme stress contributing to our earthquakes. So didn't get that quite right, but you can read it. Then up in Lake Michigan, the Geological Survey said the event is so rare, the earthquake event, the only time an earthquake with a magnitude of 2.5, which is very low, occurred in the lake in the last 100 years. Then down to North Carolina, rare earthquake reported in Marshville near Charlotte. So again, not expected. And this one to me is the most interesting. Massachusetts in January 2005, rare earthquake rattles Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. So that's the first piece of evidence. Here is a map that shows the surface temperature, which goes down about 2,000 feet, the surface waters of the Atlantic Ocean. You can see that the northern part of the ocean, just east of the United States and northwest of Africa, is very red, so that temperature is very high. And correspondingly, the southern Atlantic Ocean is not. So happening this red high heat there is another indication that the plates are moving and they're creating stress. Now you'll see some numbers on there, and we'll talk about those in a minute. These are the areas that have the most heat, and my interpretation is that these are the geological areas. The next one is upper right. That's number one. That's close to islands off of Greenland. It's called the Salvard Islands. Here's what's going on up there. There are hydrothermal vents, the picture on the right, many of them on the ocean floor in that area off coast from the Salvard Islands. Now people have, or you might ask, well, wait a second. If you only have a few of these vents, how can you warm an entire area, huge area, and all of the surface water, which creates a huge mass volume times density? So here's the reason. Starting in 2020, I think, a project was initiated, funding from many countries, called the GEBCO project. The intent of this project was to very carefully and in detail map the elevation of the ocean floor. Believe it or not, we really hadn't mapped it in detail. What this project showed is tremendous numbers of small cones, larger cones, which are hot, small ones are hydrothermal vents. The larger ones are actually volcanoes, and then some faults along the North Atlantic, and all of them seem to be emitting large amounts of heat. For instance, the hydrothermal vents are proven to emit temperatures of 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is an amazing temperature. When put that all together in the Salvard Islands area, you can warm the ocean. The next one is Greenland. And that's been in the news because of the melting glaciers. However, there are some other explanations. On the right, there's Greenland colored. Red is very hot, and this is the heat of the bedrock, not at the surface of the glaciers or not the atmosphere. So what you can see here is that there are some areas which are extremely hot underneath. That's the central one. The number two area is where that hot spot stops right along the coast. But there is high temperature in the ocean. It isn't just showed on this particular slide, but if you look at other maps, you can see that that heat extends into the ocean. So this area has become very active. The yellow line is another fault down the center of the bay on the west coast of Greenland, and that thing has become active as well. So a lot more of these vents and faults are emitting heat. So that's the first indication that the North Atlantic is really warming. Now we'll go to number three. And number three is off the coast of Virginia. And you can see in the upper right slide, in 2020, there was heat coming out of that area on the coast of Virginia. Now, I've watched this area since 2014, and it's remained about the same. There's a small amount of heat coming out, going to the northeast, close to Nova Scotia. And that area is not the outflow of rivers from Boston, New York, or other cities there. It's along the coast in Virginia, where there really aren't any large cities. So this is probably very geological. Again, I've been looked at what's going on there that speaks to the geological origin of this heat. On the lower right, you can see the various states and some long red lines. No, those red lines are placed there by me because there's a series of red dots. You can see them right here. They're very long and narrow. Those happen to be methane seeps in the ocean. Now, hydrothermal vents emit a lot of methane. So this is a direct indication that these hydrothermal vents are active. Then down here, another line, and there are a series of methane leaks along this. So those cross each other. And so all that together shows that there's a lot of heat coming out of hydrothermal vents. So the next part, we talked about stress and geological features, is moving rock layers. So on the left is a fault that moves against itself. So on the right, that part of the fault moves down here. This is the fault line right there. And then on the left, it moves upwards. What this does is it grinds the rock layers underneath this. There's multiple horizontal rock layers, and they contain a mineral called quartz. And when they do that, it creates a little energy pulse. Another slide on the right is a cut through Earth, and you can see light colored and black colored formations, and those are rich in quartz. So the left slide shows a piece of quartz, which is the light material, and primitive native people in the North American continent for a long time tried to start fires by, you've probably seen it, getting a kind of a long stick, rubbing it between their hands and set on a board or piece of bark, which has a lot of moss in it. And eventually that rubbing creates a spark and they start a fire. That was really difficult and it took a long time. So what they would do would be to store the embers or the coals that are bright in a little bag and carry them with them so they could keep the fire started. But when they saw sometimes, when they scraped the quartz together, they would see sparks like the one on the right. So they're bright lights. They're also kind of an energy pulse, but that allowed them to create fire and energy very quickly. So here's an example of a sliced through a quartz rock. And you can see in the lower right, the scale is about 1 inch. So this is a very small piece of quartz. And this clean slice through it, you can see that there are a lot of light black lines, long lines that form kind of polygonal shapes. And so those are microfractures. They're very, very small. And if you slice like this, you showed a human eye, they wouldn't see it. This is a microscope view. And so these microfractures are usually closed with different types of minerals. But on the middle of it, this slice, you can see kind of these brown outlines and then little pieces in there. Those are pieces of quartz. And this opening is a little larger than micro fractures, but not much. So when there's compressional stress on this rock, it doesn't cause an earthquake necessarily, but it does cause these little teeny pieces of quartz to move against each other, and they form down there an electrical energy pulse. So that is what starts the lights above New Jersey and other states. That electrical energy pulse, our pulses move up along open microfractures in a kind of a different pathway along the fractures, and eventually rise into more open fractures, and then into faults, and then rise up into the sky. This energy, once it reaches a tipping point, becomes a light in the atmosphere. So here's another example that this is a cut through a large portion of the Earth and goes to great depth down here. And what you see from this image is black lines, and a lot of them cross each other. Those black lines are faults. Some of them are moving, some of them aren't, and then cross faults too. So in some areas, the electrical pulse starts in rocks that contain quartz. Some of these rock layers are moving, some are stable, like we talked about, and then the electrical energy pulse makes its way up one fault that's continuous and appears in the sky as one light. So the patterns, people have seen some patterns. What that happens there is there's a lot of cross faults, and sometimes they cross each other, forming a triangle, and the energy pulses rise up there at the same time, or it might be one energy pulse that splits. And when they get to the surface in the night, they form a triangle. Same thing is true over here when people see multiple bright lights at night. There's multiple energy pulses, the result of compression or in sometimes movement, earthquakes. So just to show you at the surface what the earthquake lines look like, here they are. You can see that the lines cross each other. Some go for a long ways, some connected by triangles, and the lights at the upper part is a single, and the kind of lower middle is a square, and in the lower right, there's a lot of quakes. So this is the type of thing that occurs in New Jersey, a lot of faults. So there are various colors to the lights. This square you can see was taken from a photograph from New Jersey. And so what causes these red lights? Turns out that the rocks, the slices of rocks contain gases. Most of them, a few of them contain methane, which you've seen when you light methane on your stove. There's a little bit of red in it. So that's what's happening here. Some of the micro fractures contain methane. That's why the colors. Another characteristic of the lights is you see these lights descending to the earth. Here's one of the lights, and you see this tail back here that's descending. Some people have interpreted these type of lights as asteroids. This slide debunks that idea. You can see that there are individual lights, singles out here, and some of them are moving a little. So at the same time, this light is descending. These lights here show that it is likely not an asteroid which occurs at the same time. So here's an image comparison of the light that descends and an actual asteroid that goes down. They're about the tail behind them is about the same size. They move at about the same speed. So a lot of misinterpretation there. One of the rarest characteristics of these lights in the sky that sometimes they see actually lights on the ground, like this one here. It looks like a circle, but it's actually a sphere. So one of the rare occasions that this happened was an earthquake along the Mississippi River in 1811. That was so large an earthquake that it reversed the course of the Mississippi River. It flowed to the north instead of the south. The settlers that lived there had recorded, and there's written records, that they saw a sphere come out of the ground and move along the surface there. So that's what these spheres did. Now, the fact that they came out of the ground and did not descend from the earth is another indication that the geological layers down there are creating a lot of the energy pulses. Another characteristic is that the lights are not seen in the day. And here you can see a drone. Obviously, it's easy to see in the day. So satellites and radar pick up energy pulses and as well as solid lights. Well, they picked up a lot of energy pulses in several areas, historic, I should say, recent sightings and sightings here. They really confirmed from the satellites and radar that there were no solid drones in over New Jersey. And this really caused a lot of, I don't know, concern amongst the government officials, and the FBI were investigating this. They didn't really talk about that in the public, but they did say that the radar and the satellites saw a hard material on the West Coast, and they determined it was a balloon that was from China doing a spy. So that's an example. They saw hard materials. Again, though, in New Jersey, they didn't cite anything. So on to maps of New Jersey. The left one you can see in a black line is the outline of New Jersey, and the kind of bluish circles are where the sightings happen. It's obvious that there's a lot more sightings in the northern part of New Jersey than there is in the southern. And that north area has several characteristics that tie in with what we've been saying. On the right slide is fault lines. They're really small. You can see them moving from southwest to northeast. And so that's an example where there are a lot of faults at the surface of New Jersey, like we talked about, surface faults. You had the picture. So that right there shows that there are a lot of faults. And as I said, likely the cause of these bright lights moving upward. On the left side, in that kind of brownish area, is an outline of the areas where the rocks are extremely hard and they contain a lot of quartz. So the rock layers moving against them, they create these sparks again, and that's, of course, where the lights are. Also note where there are no quartz rock layers down the south here are very, very few. We do have a few occurrences down there, so there may be some localized types of quartz rock layers, but the north is by and large the best. Now, I'm going to start a video of the New Jersey lights. This will give you an idea how they move and the reaction of a couple people that have been sighting them.
What's up with the mysterious drones that have been flying over New Jersey for weeks? There's three right there. Groups of drones have been spotted flying over parts of northern New Jersey at night. And from what we can tell, it's been going on for at least 2 weeks. One resident says he's seen the drones almost daily, sometimes as many as 8 at a time. He estimated the larger drones to be the size of a car. The FBI has confirmed they're looking into it, but say they don't have any specifics to share as of Monday morning. Have you seen groups of mysterious drones in your area?
So hopefully that gives you a chance to see how erratic and unnatural these lights are. So there was, at the end of that, one gentleman said that they estimated them at the size of cars. Well, this is almost impossible because it depends on the height that these lights are. If they're farther away, they appear to be smaller. If they're a little closer, they appear to be larger. The distance that we're talking about here is hundreds and hundreds of miles versus actually pretty close to that. So when it's a little bit less high, you get larger sizes. So the shapes and the appearance are pretty well estimated, but the distance is, the size of the drones isn't very good. Now we're going to shift to several events that I think are positive proof that these sightings are anomalous events, not related to atmospheric forces. I've studied this one for many years and found out that I think it's very, very credible. The lightings go on for 2 months. There was 143 credible sightings. I'm not sure how they came up with that. They appeared on the radar and they scrambled F-16, which saw the lights. They were extremely high speed and they were in a geological stress area. And let's move down here. So this is an example of the geological stress area. The Belgian wave, so Belgian is outlined in the dark black line, and the red colors are where there are small earthquakes that have happened over the last few years. So that indicates that this is a stress area. The sightings happened south of Brussels, the capital, which is that big white circle. So you might ask yourself, well, how can these Belgian military people be so sure that these things are, go back to here, that these earthquakes are the cause of seeing the lights? So let's run another video. I apologize because it won't be very loud. This is going to be a colonel that headed up the Air Force of Belgium. He's been well respected and known for a lot of years.
Perhaps the most convincing evidence for UFOs can be found in Brussels, of all places. For a period of about 2 years, the whole country was affected by a wave of sightings. They'd been seen by witnesses, the police, and by local radar stations. The Belgian army was forced to take the claims seriously. They allowed their F-16 fighter aircraft to be involved in trying to intercept these UFOs. They had the full backing of the chief of the Belgian Air Staff, Colonel de Breuer.
Initially, we thought that some of these observations were caused by atmospheric interference, such as weather conditions or electromagnetic interference. But later on, we found out that at certain moments, indeed, we could relate one visual observation with one observation on the radar. And of course, then we said, well, to have a confirmation, it may be very useful to have an additional observation from an aircraft.
The aircraft were deployed as part of a routine training program. Most times nothing was seen, except on one particular night.
The night of 30 and 31st March, we had an observation on the radar, and in addition, a visual observation on the ground confirmed by the police. We decided to send 2 airplanes in the air around midnight.
This video of the F-16's radar track of the object showed the performance of a vehicle of a totally unknown origin. The Air Force were at a complete loss to explain their findings. A press conference was called.
What these pilots detected was well outside the normal flying envelope of an airplane. Sometimes they had what we call lock-ons, which gave a parameters varying from speeds between 150 knots till 990 knots. An acceleration which occurred in a few seconds.
The Americans denied it was a secret spy plane, so could it have been the first official contact with an alien craft?
These speeds would be impossible to tolerate for a human being. That's a first point. A second point is the visual observations always describe a system, a machine, which hangs and hovers above the surface at quite a low altitude without making any noise. Now, with the current technology, that would be impossible.
So far, the Belgian authorities have refused to announce any official conclusion to subsequent investigations.
Now, I want to add a few things about Colonel Browser's descriptions. What the people on the ground saw was not actually solid material. What they saw are lights and patterns. So that dispels the idea that they were drones or vehicles. Back to this one right here. They sent out lots of troops in little groups to talk to people out in the farmland in part of Brussels about what they saw. And they did see these lights. Some of them were in formations, like we talked about on the radar, scrambled, extremely high speed, stress. What was unusual about talking to these other people was they said they don't want their names out there and they don't want them on any kind of video. And all the sightings were pretty close to the same. So the military people said, look, these are credible sightings. So the next one is appearance of the lights in the southern UK along a military base. On the bottom there, you can see Woodbridge. And a deputy commander of the base, Colonel Halt, had kind of something he couldn't explain. So on one day, the security forces that ride the road around the base on the inside of large fences, metal fences, they saw in the sky very unusual lights moving around like the pilots had seen. So they completed their route and immediately went back to the command headquarters where they talked to Colonel Halt. Colonel Halt has served in Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. So this is a well-respected man who's not going to make up any kind of story. But he did say to these guys, look, I think you are kind of crazy. You sure you weren't drinking? And went on and on. And they said, no. So he said, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to go out in the next light. We're going to take a lot of people with us. And if the lights appear, which he thought wouldn't, he said, all right. And they went out there and they actually saw the lights again. And they formed patterns, erratic movements, disappeared, reappeared, high speeds, red. And there really wasn't any earthquake at that time. But as you know, a lot of animals, when they sense an earthquake is coming, they really go yelling, kind of making strange noises. That's what happened on that night. China and many other countries have been studying the reaction of animals to earthquakes for a long time. So this is probably tied to some kind of very, very small earthquake that they couldn't see. This last one is it's really unusual. On the left is the Nimitz aircraft carrier positioned off California in the San Diego area. So they launched a couple of fighters in the nighttime, and these fighters saw these unusual lights, again, moving in strange patterns, lights, all those characteristics. Now, the two pilots, one was a Top Gun graduate. So again, and this is a well-qualified pilot, and then the other pilot was a Navy commander for long years. So their sighting and description of these lights off California, of course, where there are earthquakes and stress, and some quartz lights, a quartz material, is verified that they're very real. So for years, pilots, civilian pilots, and Navy pilots, all sorts of Air Force pilots, turns out have not reported these lights because, of course, they didn't want to be thought of as crazy. So they didn't tell the commercial airlines or the military officials, with the exception, of course, of this one in Woodbridge and the one in Belgium. But other than that, there really was not much going on. Well, in 2022, Hillary Clinton and Harry Reid formed a government group called the AARO, and they had seen a lot of hidden secret videos, like the one on the left, of lights in the sky that didn't appear to be drones or anything else. So they opened that, and when they opened that, a lot of the civilian pilots and military pilots finally discussed some of these things. Another interesting factor is that several of the presidents and senators have said they saw the lights or believe in the lights. So they made that statement would indicate that they don't want it seen as crazy, that there's UFOs. So they believe something was going on. So Bill Clinton, Harry Reid, and Jimmy Carter said they had seen the lights after they got out of office. Hillary Clinton formed, of course, with Harry Reid, the AARO, and Barack Obama said that he has seen and believes in these things. Again, for these high-ranking politicians to say anything, it validates their existence. Now, explaining back a long time ago light sightings, and what I'm going to read here, well, can't prove it. Of course, there are no actual photographs, but there are accounts from the residents in China and Rome area that said earthquake lights have been recorded throughout their history, with some of the earliest documented dating back to ancient Chinese times and Roman areas. These historical accounts often describe strange glows and fireballs in the sky, so those spheres in the sky before or during seismic activities. So one of the things that I found after doing research on these geological factors was there's been some research studies that say that tectonic stress, seismic activity, can cause the earthquake lights as flashes. That's the top one. The most interesting one is that some models suggest the generation of earthquake lights involve ionization of oxygen ions by high stress before or during the earthquakes. So that, I think, is that kind of stable, non-moving stress. So now we're going to talk about interpretation bias. So what happens many times, the scientists, before they really come to a conclusion or start the analysis, they have a preconceived idea of how things work, and they fit the evidence into that preconceived idea or theory. One of the best examples, to me, is climate change. So this kind of is something that'll be very, how should I say it? People don't absolutely believe this, but what has happened is that the scientists who have seen climate changes often describe them as being from atmospheric forces. Again, they didn't look down. if they were to look down, they would see that there's a lot of geological features that warm the ocean tremendously and warm the atmosphere tremendously. So I'm not trying to degrade these scientists, and I'm not saying that everything is related to geology, but in a few cases, this is true. So this may be what's happening with the drones. They're looking up, they see lights, they attribute that to some kind of light atmospheric feature, the drones or other things. If they were to look down like climate change people, they would see something different. Another example is continental drift, which we talked about earlier, where the continents fit together like pieces of a puzzle. In 1919, a German geologist, geophysicist, Alfred Wagner, proposed the idea that continents did drift and they at one point were fit together. He used evidence as they look like puzzle pieces. Also, he saw some species of fossils that crossed against lines of the adjacent continents. Turns out that at the time, he was really criticized. There were articles in several of the Eastern papers that said he was crazy, and a lot of the consensus scientists said, this is ridiculous. Nothing was heard about there for many years until it turned out that this continental drift theory was proved. So in summary, the recent appearance of anomalous very bright nighttime lights in the atmosphere above numerous U.S. states and other countries are generated by geological forces, specifically extremely high magnitude compression stress in rock layers that are composed of high density cores. I think this theory is plausible alternative explanation. I think it deserves more look. Now, I want to make sure you understand this. I worked as a professional geologist for many years. I worked with different groups and some groups in laboratories. I'm not a speaker. I've never really done any speeches. So I know this entire thing. I'm getting off the topic, repeating myself, so that I hope that hasn't interfered with your judgment that a lot of this is true. I would hope that you would consider buying my book, latest book. It's called Geological Impacts on Climate. And so what it talks about is a lot of cases where the geology really affects climate and climate-related events. We talked a little bit about that. One of the examples is El Nino, which in the Pacific Ocean is this kind of triangle-shaped heat area. It starts at the same point, and it turns out that that point is an area where there is a lot of hydrothermal vents and faults. But scientists to this date are saying that it's caused by the atmosphere and not looking down at these areas where there's faults and emissions.
So do you think the correlation between the lights and the seismic activity is one of the biggest points, biggest pieces of evidence that the lights are caused by seismic activity, geological forces?
I think there's a lot of information here that proves it.
Yeah.
I admit it's not completely conclusive. It's not absolute proof, but it's definitely, again, worth investigation.
Is there any way to reproduce this at any sort of really small scale other than just rubbing quartz against each other? Any other way that you could possibly try to reproduce these lights close to the ground or anything?
Not that I know of. The research studies really haven't done that with all this information. Again, they just looked up in the sky. The only thing that could be useful is, like we talked about, quartz smashing against quartz and creating this. But also, of course, the historical sightings show, a few of them, that the lights were coming out of the ground. To investigate that, both things, I'm not sure how you could do it.
How about the role of methane? Would methane be part of the lights if it was close to the ground, but maybe not up higher? Or could where does methane fit in there?
Well, I worked for years, like I said, as a professional geologist with laboratories, and I looked for accumulations of methane. And many of them are in open chambers, but a lot of them have fractures above them, and there are slow leaks of the methane into the atmosphere. So it's possible that these electrical pulses in the rocks get some of that methane from accumulations in the areas. And so that's the possibility that I can think of. The methane moves up and the energy pulses just carry that methane with them. And then when they ignite the lights, that methane causes the color. But the methane originates, I think, in the ground.
And is there a relationship at all between the lights you're talking about and just the northern lights that we do see? Any sort of a similar mechanism or completely different?
That I don't know. I'm not qualified to answer that. I do know that when they first confirmed earthquake lights, which took a while, there were earthquakes, and the first sightings showed sheets of light, not little orbs coming up. So kind of like the northern lights are, they're kind of long linear waves. So they thought, okay, this is kind of like the northern lights, but it's not the same mechanism.
And does it make sense that this type of light would show up on radar? The radar could pick it up or no?
Yeah, it does make sense because the pilots verified that they saw these lights on radar, but they never could really see an aircraft. So they can't confirm that they were an aircraft. So that's it. One of the other things I didn't mention in this, you may find interesting, is that the lights are still appearing in New Jersey as of April 2025 by several reports. Now, the reports may not be so reliable, but they're out there. And so that's kind of interesting because the current administration suddenly said we know everything about them and they were all drones, and now we need to forget all that. The fact that they're occurring in April kind of says, really? If they've removed all the drones, why are we continuing to have those lights? And that's because there's continued stress, my opinion.
So would it be something to investigate that certain areas in the world like now are experiencing stress? And if you had observers go to those exact spots and look around at night to see if they did see lights there, is that a thing to do or no?
Yeah, I mean, they're appearing in California along the San Andreas Fault, which moves, and there are some quartz there, so they could go there and observe them. As far as I know, there really are no lights in any other location around the world, but a lot of people still believe that they happened. Finding them at the exact moment, studying them is really, really difficult. So I don't know that you could do that.
I mean, do you think it needs absolutely the right conditions? It sounds like they're rare enough that you need perfect conditions for this to happen.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much. Super interesting. I had not thought about this. I think most people have not thought about this possibility. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
James Camus. Goodbye.